Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are diving deep into a question that I know has crossed all of our minds at some point.
Mhm.
What happens to our consciousness when we die?
That's a big one, isn't it?
It is. And we've got an awesome mix of sources to unpack, from ancient religious texts and philosophies
Oh, right.
to modern scientific studies,
Uh,
and even firsthand accounts from people who have had near-death experiences. It's
wow.
going to be a wild ride.
You're telling me. It's a question that has fascinated humanity for millennia. And what's really interesting is how so many of these sources, even though they come from such different places and times, actually kind of converge on some pretty surprising ideas.
Okay, so before we get too far ahead of ourselves,
Yeah.
let's start with the basics. What do we even mean when we say consciousness? I mean, it's kind of a slippery concept, right?
Totally. It's like one of those things you experience every single moment.
Uh,
But it's so hard to actually define. Basically, consciousness is about awareness, being aware of yourself, your thoughts, the world around you. It's what allows you to experience things, to feel emotions, to make memories.
so it's basically like the you-ness of you.
Exactly.
But that still leaves us with the big question.
Right.
What happens to that you-ness when we die?
Right, that is the question. And that's where things get really interesting. You've got this whole spectrum of beliefs about what happens, everything from the idea of an eternal soul that lives on
Right.
to the idea that consciousness is just a product of the brain and nothing more.
Uh-huh.
So let's start by looking at how some of the world's major religions have tackled this question.
Yeah, that's a good place to start because most of us have at least some familiarity with the basic ideas behind those religions, right?
Right.
So what kind of insights do they offer?
Well, let's take Christianity, for example. Christianity basically says that we have an eternal soul that continues on after death and is judged for our actions in life. It's then sent to heaven or hell. So, in that view, consciousness doesn't just vanish. It keeps going in a spiritual realm.
So it's like a continuation, but there's some pretty high stakes involved.
Exactly.
What about other religions? Do they have similar beliefs about the soul and the afterlife?
Some do, yeah, but with their own interesting twists, like Hinduism and Buddhism, even though they're very different in many ways, both kind of embrace this idea of reincarnation. So in those traditions, your consciousness doesn't just end when you die. It's reborn into a new life based on your actions in your past lives. You know, that whole concept of karma.
Yeah.
And this cycle just keeps going until you reach enlightenment, this state of being completely spiritually liberated.
Whoa, so death isn't the end in those religions. It's more like a cosmic reset button.
That's a great way to put it.
That definitely adds another layer to
Mhm.
how we might think about what we do in this life and the consequences of our actions.
Absolutely. And then you've got Islam, which kind of like Christianity, puts a big emphasis on a final judgment and an eternal afterlife, but with its own specific beliefs about what that afterlife actually looks like and what it means for us.
So it seems like a lot of religions, even though they have their differences, tend to agree that consciousness continues on in some form after death. But obviously not everyone believes that.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. You've got a whole other school of thought called materialism. Materialists believe that consciousness is just a product of the brain's physical processes, nothing more, nothing less. So when the brain dies, consciousness just ceases to exist.
So lights out, end of story.
Pretty much, yeah.
This seems kind of bleak, don't you think?
Yeah.
What's the point of it all if everything just vanishes?
I can see why some people might find that view kind of depressing. But to be fair, the materialist perspective is based on the idea that everything in the universe can be explained by physical laws and processes. And honestly, there is a lot of evidence that shows the brain plays a critical role in creating consciousness. But even with all that, even within that framework, there are some really interesting questions that come up.
Like what?
Well, like, could consciousness somehow go beyond the physical body? Even if it starts in the brain, could it maybe exist in some other form after the brain is gone, you know?
Okay, so we've got the spiritual side saying that consciousness continues and the materialist saying it's all about the brain and when the brain's done, it's over. So where does science fit into all this? Does modern science support either one of these sides?
Well, as you might expect, science tends to lean more towards the materialist perspective. But honestly, it's not that simple. There's a lot of research going on right now that's really challenging what we thought we knew about consciousness and how it relates to the brain, especially when it comes to near-death experiences and what happens during cardiac arrest.
Those are the things that I find really fascinating. Because if consciousness is just a product of the brain, then how do you explain people who report these vivid, detailed experiences while they were clinically dead?
Right. That's one of the most interesting parts of this whole debate. You've probably heard of near-death experiences or NDEs, where people who have technically died, at least for a short time,
Yeah.
report all these incredible experiences, seeing bright lights, feeling a sense of overwhelming peace, or even meeting up with loved ones who have already passed away.
Yeah, those stories are fascinating. I have to admit, though, I've always been a little bit skeptical. Couldn't those experiences just be like the brain's last little burst of activity before it shuts down?
A lot of people think that, and some scientists do suggest that NDEs could be caused by weird brain activity during a near-death event. But here's what's really interesting. These experiences are often surprisingly similar across different people, regardless of their background, culture, or their beliefs beforehand. And sometimes people even report specific details about what was going on while they were supposedly unconscious details that were later confirmed by doctors or nurses.
So you're saying they're not just making stuff up, they're accurately remembering things that happened while they were, for all intents and purposes, dead. That's kind of mind-blowing. I mean, if consciousness is just tied to the brain, how is that even possible?
It's a great question, and honestly, it really does challenge the traditional understanding of how our perception and awareness work. Now, of course, it doesn't completely prove that consciousness leaves the body,
Right.
but it definitely makes you wonder about what exactly is happening with consciousness during these really unusual situations.
I bet those experiences have a profound impact on the people who have them. It's not something you just forget about and go back to your everyday life, is it?
You're absolutely right. NDEs are often described as being truly life-changing. People say they feel a deep sense of peace,
Wow.
encounter these beings of light or deceased loved ones, and even gain these insights into the nature of reality that totally change their perspective on life and death.
It almost sounds like a spiritual awakening for some people.
It really does.
And even if some people try to explain it away as just hallucinations, the effect that these experiences have on people is undeniable. It really makes you wonder what's going on in the brain during these events
Yeah.
and what they might tell us about the potential for consciousness to exist even beyond the physical body.
Exactly. The way people experience NDEs and the way it changes their lives are super significant, regardless of whether or not we can explain them scientifically. And, these accounts of consciousness seemingly doing its own thing separate from the brain aren't just limited to NDEs. We also have reports from people who claim to remember past lives, which just adds another layer of intrigue to this whole conversation.
Ah, past life regression. Now, that's something that always gets people talking.
It does.
Some people find it really fascinating, while others think it's total nonsense. So, what do people typically report when they go through past life regression? Are we talking about people saying they were royalty or famous people in their past lives?
Well, in past life regression therapy, basically, people are guided into a deep state of relaxation, and then they're encouraged to remember things that they believe are from previous lives.
Okay.
They might describe very specific details about a totally different time period, a different culture, or even a different body altogether.
Wow.
And yes, some people do say they were historical figures, but it's not always that exciting. A lot of people report living really normal, everyday lives in different times and circumstances.
Okay, but hold on a sec. If you're talking about actual memories from past lives,
Yeah.
wouldn't that mean that consciousness actually survives death and is then carried over into a new life? That's a pretty crazy concept. How do researchers even begin to try and make sense of that?
It's definitely a concept that pushes the boundaries of what we usually think. Some people see those experiences as evidence of reincarnation,
Right.
suggesting that consciousness could actually jump from one life to the next. But then, of course, you have other people who are much more skeptical. They say these memories are just products of the therapist leading the person on,
Oh,
or maybe just the person's imagination running wild, or maybe even the subconscious mind digging up information that's somehow been stored in the brain all along. It's a really fascinating area to study, even if we don't have all the answers figured out yet.
it sounds like a giant question mark hanging over this whole idea of a past life regression. Is it real? Is it fake? Is it something in between?
Right.
But I guess the fact that it's such a mystery just makes it all the more interesting.
Yeah.
It definitely feeds into this idea that consciousness might be way more complex and mysterious than we realize right now.
It definitely does. And that's what I think makes this whole deep dive so captivating. We've got so many different points of view, so many questions we can't answer. It really makes us confront these fundamental mysteries of life, doesn't it?
It totally does. So, okay, we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've talked about religious beliefs, scientific theories, and people's personal experiences, all trying to answer this big question of what happens to our consciousness after we die. It's been a whirlwind.
Uh-huh.
I have to admit, I'm still wrapping my head around it all. Have we actually come to any
Well,
conclusions?
I wouldn't say we have any definite answers, and I think that's kind of the beauty of it all. The mystery's still there, but I think what we have done is show all these fascinating possibilities, everything from the soul continuing on in an afterlife to consciousness just stopping completely when the brain dies. And we've seen how scientists are always pushing the boundaries of what we know, challenging our assumptions about how the brain and consciousness are connected, and if there's anything beyond that connection. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts after going through all this? Has anything in particular really stood out to you?
I started this whole deep dive feeling pretty skeptical,
Yeah.
but I'm finding it hard to just dismiss the sheer number of these experiences, especially those NDE accounts where people remember very specific details that were later confirmed. It's definitely getting me a lot to think about.
I hear you.
And then there's that quantum consciousness theory, which is just, wow,
Yeah.
it suggests that consciousness might not be limited by the physical brain
Right.
and could actually exist in a realm beyond space and time. That's both exciting and a little terrifying to think about.
I totally get that. It's one thing to understand these concepts intellectually, up here in your head, but it's a whole other thing to actually absorb them and think about what they might mean for how we live our lives and how we understand reality. It's a journey that can be both challenging and really rewarding.
Absolutely. It's about embracing the mystery, even if we might never fully solve it. But, I think we've got time for one more twist in this conversation before we wrap up this part of our deep dive. We've talked a lot about what might happen after death, but what about those moments leading up to it?
Hmm.
I'm talking about those last flickers of consciousness as someone is transitioning from life to whatever comes next. Is there anything in our sources that talk about that?
That's a great point. That's something we haven't touched on yet. And it's a really powerful topic with all sorts of scientific and philosophical implications.
Right.
Actually, yeah, there are some interesting observations and accounts related to those last moments of consciousness that we could definitely explore.
Perfect, because I think our listeners are ready to go even deeper into this mystery. So let's dive into those final moments, shall we?
Let's do it. Okay, so let's get into some of those personal accounts, especially the ones about near-death experiences. One thing you see a lot in NDEs is this feeling of leaving your body.
Oh, yeah. It's like that classic out-of-body experience, the kind you see in movies.
Exactly.
But here we're talking about real people describing what they actually felt.
Yeah.
Do people actually see things happening around them when they're supposedly unconscious?
That's what's so fascinating about these stories. Many people say they were watching things from a distance, almost like they were floating near the ceiling looking down.
Wow. Okay.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Some people even describe specific details that they couldn't have known if they were truly unconscious.
Really?
Yeah. And later on, those details were actually confirmed by the medical staff or by other people who were there.
So they're not just imagining things. They're accurately remembering what was happening around them while they were clinically dead. That's pretty hard to believe.
It is.
I mean, if consciousness is really just a function of the brain, how is that even possible?
That's the big question, isn't it? It really challenges our understanding of how we perceive and experience the world. Now, I'm not saying this definitively proves that consciousness can leave the body,
Well,
but it definitely raises some serious questions about what consciousness is and how it works, especially during those really unusual moments.
I bet those experiences have a huge impact on the people who have them. It's not something you just shake off and forget about, is it?
Absolutely not. People often describe NDEs as these incredibly powerful, life-changing events. They say they felt an overwhelming sense of peace,
Wow.
encountered these beings of light or deceased loved ones, and gained these incredible insights into the nature of reality that totally changed their perspective on life and death.
It almost sounds like some people go through a kind of spiritual awakening because of these experiences.
Yeah, it really does.
And even if some people try to explain them away as just hallucinations, you can't deny the impact these experiences have on people. It makes you wonder what's really happening in the brain during those moments and what they might tell us about the potential for consciousness to exist beyond the physical body.
Exactly. And these stories about consciousness seemingly operating independently of the brain aren't just from NDEs.
Oh.
We also have accounts from people who claim to remember past lives.
Past life regression. That's a topic that always gets people fired up. Some people find it fascinating, and others think it's complete hogwash.
It's definitely a controversial topic.
So what do people usually say they remember during these past life regression sessions? Are we talking about people claiming to have been kings and queens or famous people?
Well, in past life regression therapy, people are basically guided into this deep state of relaxation and then encouraged to access memories that they believe come from their past lives. They might give very specific details about a totally different time period, culture, or even a different body.
Oh.
And yeah, some people do say they were famous figures in the past, but it's not always so glamorous. Many people report living pretty ordinary lives in different times and circumstances.
Okay, but hold on. If we're talking about actual memories from past lives,
Yeah.
wouldn't that suggest that consciousness somehow survives death and is carried into a new life? That's a pretty wild idea. How do researchers even approach that concept?
It's definitely a mind-bending idea, right? Some people see those experiences as evidence of reincarnation.
Right.
The idea that consciousness can transmigrate from one life to another. But then, of course, you have other people who are more skeptical. They might say that these memories are just the result of the therapist's suggestions,
Right.
or maybe the person's imagination, or even just the subconscious mind somehow digging up information that's been stored in the brain all along. It's a really fascinating area to explore, even though we don't have all the answers yet.
It sounds like a giant question mark hanging over the whole concept of past life regression.
It kind of is.
Is it real?
Yeah.
Is it all in the person's head? Is it something in between? I guess the mystery just makes it even more intriguing. But it does seem to support the idea that consciousness might be much more complex and strange than we currently understand.
I think so too. And that's what makes this whole deep dive so interesting. There are so many different perspectives, so many unanswered questions. It really makes you think about the most fundamental mysteries of existence, doesn't it?
It really does. Okay, so we've covered a ton of information.
We have.
We've looked at religious beliefs, scientific theories, and people's personal experiences, all trying to grapple with this big question of what happens to consciousness after we die. It's been a whirlwind.
I know, right?
I have to admit, I'm still processing everything. Have we actually reached any conclusions?
Well, I wouldn't say we have any definitive answers. And honestly, I think that's part of what makes it so fascinating. The mystery remains. But what we have done is explore this whole range of possibilities, from the idea that the soul continues on in an afterlife to the idea that consciousness just stops when the brain dies.
Right.
And we've seen how science is constantly pushing the limits of what we know, challenging our assumptions about how the brain and consciousness are related, and if there's anything beyond that connection.
So after going through all this, what are your thoughts? Has anything stood out to you?
That's a good question.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
You know, when we started this deep dive, I was pretty skeptical. But I have to admit, it's hard to just ignore the sheer volume of these experiences, especially the NDE accounts,
Yeah.
where people remember really specific things that are later confirmed. It's definitely made me think twice about some things.
It's powerful stuff, isn't it?
It is. And then there's that quantum consciousness theory, which just blows my mind.
I know.
The idea that consciousness might not be limited by the physical brain and could exist beyond space and time is both exciting and a little bit scary.
I get that. It's one thing to understand these ideas intellectually, but it's another thing to really internalize them and consider what they might mean for how we live our lives and understand reality. It can be a tough journey, but also incredibly rewarding.
Absolutely. It's all about embracing the mystery, even if we never completely figure it out. But you know what? So I think we've got time for one more twist in this whole conversation before we wrap things up. We've talked a lot about what might happen after death.
We have.
But what about those final moments right before death? You know, those last little bits of consciousness as someone is transitioning from life to whatever comes next. Is there anything in the sources that talks about that?
You know what? That's a great point. That's actually something we haven't explored yet. And it's a really poignant topic full of scientific and philosophical implications. As a matter of fact, there are some interesting observations and accounts about those final moments of consciousness that we could dive into.
Perfect, because I think our listeners are ready to go even deeper into this mystery. Let's explore those final moments, shall we?
Let's do it.
All right, so we're going deep into those final moments of consciousness as someone is transitioning from life to death. It's a bit of a heavy topic, but I'm really curious to know what our sources say about this transition. Like, is there anything about how consciousness actually fades? Do people experience specific things in those last moments?
It's a really interesting area, and as you can imagine, it's not easy to get solid scientific data on this.
Yeah, I bet.
But there are some really insightful observations from people who work closely with those who are dying. Hospice workers, nurses, doctors, they've witnessed so many people make that final transition.
So what have they seen? Is there like a pattern to how consciousness fades? Do people seem to know what's happening, or is it just this gradual slipping away?
One thing they often observe is that as the body starts to shut down, it's like consciousness slowly withdraws from the outside world. Yeah. The senses get weaker, the person's focus narrows, and they seem to detach from their surroundings. It's like they're gradually letting go of this reality and moving on to somewhere else.
That makes sense. But is there any awareness left at that point?
Yeah.
Or is it just a purely biological decline with no conscious experience?
That's the question that has puzzled people forever.
I bet.
And while we can't really know for sure what's going on inside someone's mind as they're dying,
Right.
there are these anecdotal accounts that suggest something pretty remarkable might be happening.
Really?
Yeah, hospice workers and nurses have reported seeing cases where people, even when they seem completely unresponsive,
Wow.
will suddenly have a burst of lucidity or awareness right before death.
You're kidding. So it's like a last spark of consciousness before the flame goes out completely.
Yeah.
What do people say or do during these moments?
Sometimes it's like they suddenly recognize loved ones who are there with them, even if they hadn't shown any awareness before that.
Right.
It's as if they become totally lucid and aware of their surroundings one last time. And sometimes it's a verbal expression, a phrase, a sentence that seems to hold a lot of meaning for them,
Wow.
even if the people around them don't quite understand it.
That's amazing and
Yeah.
a little bit spooky.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what's happening in their minds, what they might be seeing or experiencing in those final moments. Do any of the sources we looked at offer any insight into that? Is it just random brain activity, or could it be something more?
Well, we can't know for sure, but people who believe in an afterlife often interpret these final moments of clarity as a glimpse into the soul's journey as it's moving on,
Yeah.
a moment of connection with something beyond this world. It's a beautiful thought, even though we can't prove it scientifically.
I can see why people find that comforting, especially when facing something as mysterious and final as death. But it also raises even more questions, doesn't it?
Yeah, so
Like, what is that something beyond? What form does it take? And what does it even mean for consciousness to exist without a body?
you're hitting on the big questions that have driven philosophical and religious thought for centuries. And to be honest, we may never have the answers. But I think the real beauty lies in asking the questions,
Yeah.
in wrestling with these mysteries, and trying to understand what's possible.
Totally agree with you there.
Yeah.
It's about being okay with not knowing everything, accepting the limits of what we can understand, and realizing that there might be parts of reality that are just beyond our grasp right now. And this whole deep dive has really shown us that.
It has.
We've looked at so many different perspectives, from ancient beliefs to modern science, and it's clear that the mystery of consciousness is still alive and well.
It definitely is.
Yeah.
And even if science one day figures out exactly how consciousness works in the brain, there's still this really fundamental question we have to grapple with. What is the nature of subjective experience? What does it actually feel like to be conscious, to experience the world, to have emotions, to make memories? Those are questions that go beyond just mapping the brain.
There you go again, leaving us with one final mind-blowing question that I'm going to be thinking about for days. But I think it's a perfect way to wrap things up.
I agree. It's a good reminder that even as we search for answers and try to make sense of the world, there will always be things that remain a mystery. And there's a certain beauty in that.
Well said. A huge thank you to you for guiding us through all of this. And all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the mysteries of consciousness and death. We hope you enjoyed the ride.
It was my pleasure. And to everyone listening, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never lose that curiosity about the world around you and the consciousness that allows you to experience it all.
That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time for another fascinating exploration.